The moment I saw the cover art for Bad for Good in a record store in the early 80s, I made the decision to buy it without ever having heard a single track. The artwork promised me something epic, and I wasn't disappointed. Bad for Good was my introduction to Jim Steinman, and as a byproduct, my introduction to Meat Loaf as well. It turns out that most of the songs on Bad for Good were actually supposed to be part of Meat Loaf's follow-up album to Bat Out of Hell. That album would have been called Renegade Angel, but due to extensive touring to support Bat, Meat was suffering from vocal problems and could not record. When Meat Loaf lost his voice, Steinman called the experience a nightmare. So instead of waiting for Meat Loaf to recover, Steinman recorded the songs himself and retitled the album Bad for Good. When I first heard it, I was under the impression that Steinman sang lead on all of the tracks. This turned out not to be true. In fact, on my favorite tracks, Rory Dodd contributes the lead vocals. Bad for Good does sound like the logical follow-up to Bat Out of Hell, and makes a lot of sense because many of the same musicians performed on both albums. Like Bat Out of Hell, renowned artist Richard Corbin illustrated the cover. It sucked me in and persuaded me to part with my cold, hard cash. The first two songs, Bad for Good and Lost Boys and Golden Girls, were two of many songs written by Steinman under the inspiration of Peter Pan, about lost boys who never grew up. Steinman said that Peter Pan had always been one of his favorite stories. When the album was originally released, it came in the form of an LP and an EP. The EP contained the song Rock and Roll Dreams Come Through, as well as an orchestral piece called The Storm. Steinman considered these two pieces to be bookends for the main story, which was contained on the album. Steinman has said, "I've always looked at it from the perspective that it's a great rock and roll myth, because it's about, when you get right down to it, it's about a gang of lost boys who never grew up, who are going to be young forever, and that's about as perfect an image for rock and roll as I can think of." Steinman's epic vision of the rock and roll myth later manifested itself on albums by Bonnie Tyler, Air Supply, and believe it or not, even Barbra Streisand, who recorded a track from Bad for Good called Left in the Dark. Eventually, Meat got his voice back, and over the years, Mr. Loaf has gotten around to recording most of the tracks on Bad for Good for his own albums. Surf's Up appeared on a 1984 album called Bad Attitude, but most of the songs showed up on Bat Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell. Those include Rock and Roll Dreams Come Through, Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire, Love and Death and an American Guitar, which was renamed Wasted Youth, but still performed by Jim Steinman, and of course, the classic track Lost Boys and Golden Girls. Left in the Dark, which had since that time been performed by Barbra Streisand, showed up on his Meat Loaf's 1995 album, Welcome to the Neighborhood. And Bat Out of Hell 3, The Monster Is Loose, contained a version of Bad for Good with guest performer Brian May from Queen on guitar. For an album that's considered, or at least was considered, a bit of a disappointment when it was initially released, Bad for Good has stood the test of time and clearly has had a profound impact on the careers of many different musicians, as well as the fans of Jim Steinman and Meat Loaf. We as fans have been able to listen to many different arrangements of these classic songs over the years, and while they're all good, I will always be partial to the renditions of the songs by Meat Loaf.